Well, the left has constantly claimed that we're in the middle of a constitutional crisis because of the Trump administration. But a lot of people right now are saying that maybe the real source of any sort of constitutional crisis actually comes with a very activist federal judiciary that seems to be adamant about stopping the Trump administration at every single turn. Now, listen, one of the things that we predicted early on was that if Trump won and he started going after the bureaucracy was going to fight back, but the court system would also be the place that the left would attempt to fight the Trump administration. And that is exactly what we're seeing. So today, we're going to go over some of the most ridiculous judicial decisions that have taken place recently in an attempt to thwart the Trump administration. But we're also going to be honest. There may be times where a justice makes a fair point. And so we'll analyze some of those points and we'll ask what the correct course of action should be. Not to mention the fact there has also been a question of holding the judiciary accountable. And one of the mechanisms for doing that is impeachment. And this has caused a problem between President Trump and Chief Justice John Roberts. We're going to be discussing that along with taking various questions from the audience. So all of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello. I am not Queen of the Bees anymore.
Her bees flew away.
My last hive, they have absconded. I could see that they had created a queen cell to make a new queen, but everybody was gone. So they all just
You were
left.
dethroned?
I guess so. But they did leave me about 2 gallons of honey, and I got that out yesterday.
There we go. We'll get more bees, honey. It's okay. You were too benevolent of a queen. They didn't mind.
I'm also worried about the fact that you need you need nerd juice to survive a bee sting. So
Wow. You know what? We're going to Christian now. Christian, my true friend, resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia. How are you doing?
I voted for a constitutional crisis.
Christian's like, I voted for this. Totally what I voted for. Oh, man. Well, listen, I think let's just, again, to kind of kick this off, say a couple of things. One, I think everyone around this, well, I won't say everyone. Christian is kind of moving farther away from this. I still believe in separation of powers and co-equal branches of government, but there has been a question, and this is something Thomas Jefferson had actually talked about. He was always worried about the tyranny of the judiciary because it's kind of difficult to have this kind of standalone objective judiciary where you can also hold it accountable. And there was also concerns with respect to the judiciary ultimately assuming for itself this position where it got to be the sole arbiter of what was constitutional and what wasn't. And that begs the question. It's like if you are a co-equal branch of government, but you can't be held accountable and you get to decide what's constitutional, you're not co-equal anymore. You're not co-equal anymore. And the question is has the left attempted to manipulate that? And so that's what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at some of those judicial decisions to decide whether or not that's actually taking place. Now, one thing I can say with absolute certainty, one thing that I think any judge in their right mind would uphold is that if you're not subscribed to Good Ranchers, well then why do you hate America? Why do you?
And why do you hate
America?
yourself?
And why do you hate yourself? That's an even better question because Good Ranchers is delicioso. And we know because we consume Good Ranchers pretty much every single day because they have some of the best beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood you can get anywhere. And right now, here's the best part. I love this, right? Right now, if you subscribe to any Good Ranchers box, you'll get your choice of free bacon, ground beef, seed oil-free chicken nuggets. And again, I talked about the chicken nuggets last time. They're actually, I'm a chicken nugget snob. I make my own. I don't use any seed oil. I'm picky about it. I am known for at least 4 blocks for being the best chicken nugget maker ever. And I got their stuff. And I got to say, we kind of did a blind taste test and it was a little bit offensive to see how much my kids like that one versus my uniquely crafted chicken nuggets, but they do an excellent job. Or salmon. You can also get salmon if none of that other stuff appealed to you. Free in every order for a year plus $40 off your first order. So if you are looking for a way to support yourself, to support the show, to support America and America's farmers, goodranchers.com/Nick. Again, not only do you get it would be delicious enough by itself, but $40 off plus free additional meat in every order for the link of your subscription.
I was so excited to get the extra meat this last time. That was fantastic. It's always a good thing to get more meat than you expected.
This is the thing now. This is a thing now. You not only with Good Ranchers, not only do you get great meat, you also get innuendo brought to you by Tina. All right. Again, go to goodranchers.com. Use promo code Nick.
You don't even need the promo code for that.
Christian's sitting here like this is a hostage situation and he can't go anywhere. He's just stuck.
They're going to start doing promo code Tina. It's like, I can just see how these commercials get. Are you lonely? That's okay. Yeah. That's not a. Anyway, all right, back to the family-friendly portion of our programming.
So lots of things are happening lately in the court system.
Wow, you segued that quick. Were you?
Yeah, I'm trying to get us.
Is it making you uncomfortable?
I'm trying to get us back on track.
All right, let's go ahead and get into some of the most ridiculous judicial decisions that have come up as of recent. So,
you know what's crazy about this?
What?
We're about to go through I can't even remember 5, 6, 7 stories,
Yeah.
and the oldest of them was from 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. Oh, they're pulling out all this. Well, this is two things. One, they're pulling out all the stops. Two, they had already prepped this, right? The ACLU,
the lawsuits were drafted before the executive orders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so they knew they were going to do this. All right. What's our first one?
Here's the first one. Supreme Court denies Trump request to block $2 billion foreign aid payments. So we all remember the USAID scandal. I actually got to know one of the people that kind of broke this, which was Data Republican. Elon discovered her on X.
Go follow her on X. By the way, real quick, she has not only been doxxed, they've actually been going after her. They've been going after her husband. Her husband, I think, has a distillery. They're trying to destroy his business. So if you do partake, go find out what her husband's. We'll try to find out what her husband's distillery is.
Yeah, her and I got to know each other over the election cycle because we were both modeling particular states, and then we kind of built a friendship around that, and we've hosted a few Twitter Spaces together. And one of the things that we talked about was actually her grant search tool, where basically you can go on to her X account. She's got a link there, and you can type in any keyword you want, and it'll pull up every single federal grant basically that in the description will have that keyword in there somewhere. And one of the things that we discovered is that, lo and behold, we were dishing out not even billions, tens of billions in foreign aid spending that in reality was really going to ideologically very progressive left-wing NGOs in the name of doing X, Y, and Z. And it turns out that X, Y, and Z were things like Colombian trans operas. And
transing the kids in India.
Yeah. And so one of the things that Trump and Elon wanted to do was, well, why are we paying for the privilege of A, shipping out a bunch of money to foreign countries, and B, funneling it into our ideological enemies? Let's, stop doing that. Yeah. Well, it turns out that the left didn't like that, and so they immediately sued to force the executive branch to continue paying out these contracts. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court basically sided with the NGOs.
We had a 5-4 decision with Justice Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett siding with the 3 liberal justices. The justification was, here's the justification they used, if I remember this correctly. It was, there's a certain point where Congress allocates funds that once contracts have been awarded, the funds have to go out. And part of that is because in some cases, you actually have companies which part of the contractual obligation is they spend money to actually compete for these contracts. And when they win the contract, if all of a sudden you cancel it or you move the money for it, they're kind of out. And so there's on some level of breach of contract. And that was essentially the justification that they were using for this. I think that's a little dubious, especially when I see like Roberts. I'm not a big fan of Justice John Roberts because I don't believe he has like a coherent judicial philosophy, and we'll get into judicial philosophy later. But I do think Thomas does, right? I do think Alito does, especially those two. And so I tend to favor that kind of originalist interpretation. So, but yeah, that was the first one. It was like literally telling the president, nope, we know you've identified this as wasteful spending. We know that when Congress allocated these funds, they didn't specifically allocate them to go to LGBTQ programs or to go to this. They handed the funds over to the executive branch agency, which is a whole nother issue right now, executive branch agency. But the degree of discretion that was allowed the executive branch agency and the degree to which the funds had already been distributed was enough for the Supreme Court or those 2 members to side with the 3 liberal justices and say, yeah, it still has to go out. And so it's creating 2 things. One, it's creating a question on how much control does the executive branch really have over funds being distributed, especially when they're being distributed to dubious propositions. And two, what is Congress's renewed obligation in order to fix this as well? But yeah, great example of a recent case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, because most of the cases that we're looking at today have not made it to the Supreme Court yet.
So basically, they're burning money, but the money is set to be sent by Congress. So therefore, you must continue to allow them to burn the money.
It has reached a stage where we are now contractually obligated to use your tax dollars for things that you would probably be horrified to find out your tax dollars are being used for.
Well,
Yeah.
we were horrified to find out.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the first story. That was a big one. Here's the next one. Do you want me to read through these?
Yeah,
headlines,
go
or-
for it.
okay.
Go for it.
So this next one is 2 judges in mass firing cases order Trump administration to rehire probatory workers for now. So the context for this is that you have for new federal employees, there's basically like what they call a
6
probation
month.
period.
Yeah.
It's I think it's actually a year, not 6 months.
Okay.
Where they haven't yet necessarily been hired as a full-time employee, and so the way that this system works is basically to see like, can they do the job that they're working for, and then they can have the opportunity to become a full-time employee.
Yeah.
Seems
Well-
like it should be much easier to fire those people than other
So
people.
that was the Trump administration's logic, which is, look, it might be politically more difficult or legalistically more difficult for us to do mass firings within the entire federal workforce. They're still trying to do that, of course. But we can at least begin with all of the workers that were hired within the last 12 months under the Biden administration as they were basically on their way out the door. And so they did that. They basically like went in and said, like, all of you are fired.
Yeah.
And obviously they were sued on that. And this went to the court system as well. And there were multiple judges. I think there were 2 in this case. I mean, that's what the headline says.
Yeah.
Where the judges basically compelled the White House to rehire these fired federal employees that, again, aren't even yet official.
The probationary. Now, the reason here, the justification that they used, and this is, again, this is one of those points where we want to give people, we don't want to just say this all sucks. We want to explain what is the reasoning that is being used. We can decide to agree with it or not. In Baltimore, U.S. District Judge James Bretter found that the administration did not follow laws set out for large-scale layoffs, including 60 days advance notice. Now, here's what I will say. If the law says that they're entitled to 60 days advance notice, there is a legal justification to say you got to give them 60 days advance notice. But that should be it, right? That should be it. Hey, you can't fire them right now. You got to give them 60 days notice before you completely terminate them. Now, if we don't like that, and I think 60 days notice is ridiculous, show me in the private sector where you get 60 days notice before you're fired, right? You usually give 2 weeks.
To me, like if you're firing somebody for cause, if you're firing somebody and giving them 60 days notice that you're firing them, to me, that gives them the opportunity to sabotage things.
No, it absolutely does. And here's the other thing that, first of all, that 60 days is ridiculous. Second of all, this is something that we need to understand. I think Trump knows that some of these things he's doing are going to get caught up in court. Well, I know he knows that they're going to get caught up in court. Part of what he is revealing here is not just, hey, look how hard it is for the executive branch to do their job. Part of what he's revealing is, look at these sorts of benefits. Look at these sorts of requirements. This is the sort of thing where you look at it and go like, okay, the executive branch did what they could. Congressional, legislative branch, what the hell? Right? This is a perfect example of how the legislature has actually worked in such a way as to insulate the bureaucracy from the real world. And so this is the sort of thing where, again, I'm applauding what Trump is doing, because part of what the court case does is reveal to the American people what's actually going on within the bureaucracy.
I just pulled this up last second. I know this wasn't originally in our outline.
Yeah,
but,
go for it.
But we've got to go through this. Here's the argument. Ultimately, I think that this is more of a political power struggle than it is
Absolutely.
honest, good faith,
Absolutely.
anything. What really happened is that these judges, ordered the White House to rehire Democrats, is what they did. Right. That's ultimately why they care about this.
Yeah.
The same people that were telling us that, well, the Constitution was written by, rich, white, slave-owning men in 2020, and we need to tear down statues to our founding fathers, are now invoking the Constitution. Why? To defend the bureaucratic state,
Yeah.
not to defend the American people. But if you're searching for a legalistic out, if you're in the White House, and they've already done this.
Yeah.
There's a neat thing within the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. This is Title V, subchapter 7511. For the purposes of this subchapter, they define what an employee is. Right, an employee means that basically somebody that's who's not serving in a probatory trial period under the initial probationary, or who has completed 1 year of current continuous service. So that's kind of interesting. But more importantly, so it defines an employee, right? And then it defines what suspension, grade, pay, furlough. These are all legalistic terms. But here's the part that's really important, because this is providing civil service protections to federal workers.
Yeah.
Well, it says at the end of this whole thing, it says this subchapter does not apply to an employee whose appointment is made by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. So a cabinet, level.
They're purely at will of the president.
Yeah. But here's the more important part: whose position has been determined to be of a confidential, policy determining, policy making, or policy advocating character by the president or the Office of Personnel Management for a position that the office is suspected, or the president or the head of an agency. Like, basically what this means is that the president, this is Schedule F.
Yeah.
I'm literally reading off to you Schedule F.
Well, and
here.
the way that they defined it is policy making, policy advocating, policy determining. So they basically took a blanket and threw it over everybody.
Yes.
I mean,
and the argument that Trump's lawyers should absolutely be making is effectively that there is no such thing as a non-policy making federal employee.
Yeah.
Or policy determining, or policy advocating. You are guaranteed you are one of those three.
Because the argument that they're going to make is that regardless of what position that you serve, you are impacting policy. And what's interesting is the left is going to say, oh, that's ridiculous. You think the janitor is impacting policy, to which I'm going to look at them and be like, I'm old enough to remember the Filburn decision where you guys decided that if I grew wheat on my own property for my own consumption, that was impacting interstate commerce.
Also, the janitor is doing an actual job that provides a service, unlike most of these other people. If it was the janitors getting fired, you might have a point.
Yeah,
but they're not, because they're actually doing a job.
I do not want. I want to fire I want to fire the brass at the Pentagon that were leaking military secrets to the Chinese in order to undermine Trump in 2019 and 2020. I don't want to fire the janitors at the Pentagon. I want to fire the bureaucrats. Is who I want to fire.
Again, the important thing here is that I think what you're finding is a judiciary that is not at all curious when it comes to upholding whatever Joe Biden or Barack Obama or Bill Clinton want to do, but then all of a sudden becomes strict originalists when it's President Trump. And the issue that you see here is like, okay, you didn't give 60 days notice. Okay, well, if that's it, then I guess what you've just acknowledged is that as long as 60 days notice is given, they can all be fired, correct? See, this is one of the things where I do think a lot of times when people say that, oh, politicians are playing four-dimensional chess. I have met a lot of politicians. Some politicians play 4D chess. Some are playing checkers and others are just licking windows. All right. I honestly believe that he's playing 4D chess with some of this, because when you get a decision that comes down, one, you expose what is actually going on with the bureaucracy instead of it just being this he said, she said political food fight. Two, you actually force a justice to clarify the actual process or procedures. Okay, under what conditions can they be fired? If the decision is 60 days, okay, great. 60 days, you're done. Well, now what are you going to do? Well, no, we didn't. No. You said six. And then the third component here is that also I think that some of these justices are hurrying a little bit too quickly to try to render decisions without recognizing that it may say 60 days over here, but Schedule F says if the president has classified you within this category, does he still need to give you 60 days?
And not only that, but in the very beginning, it gave you a definition of what an employee is. And if somebody's under a probationary period, it doesn't apply.
Well, but that's going to be the question, right? That's going to be the question if there's different legal criteria that covers probationary employees, right? Like I don't know the answer to that question, and I'm sure that's something that Trump's lawyers will go to. But what I need to emphasize here is whether he wins this case or not, he wins because A, people are becoming aware of just how absurd this is, and B, he's either creating a mechanism where Congress now has to act in order to address this, right? Or he gets the judge to admit, oh yeah, you couldn't do it if you just did this. Okay, fine, 60 days and then you're all fired, right? So that's kind of the genius of this, is that he still wins.
And now it's been
see
over
where-
60 days. So he could hire them just to fire them again and be like, well, that previous firing was just your
Well,
notification.
no, the judge stopped the firings for some of these guys. So now we can be like, okay, you had your 60 days.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So you see where we're going with this, where it's like de facto the federal courts have basically overturned the results of the 2024 presidential election, because what they're doing is that they're undermining the president's ability to actually do anything. I mean, the list that I've got right in front of me is, so far they've issued rulings to force him to continue paying out billions to left-wing NGOs, to rehire federal employees that he's fired. And now the third one that we'll go to, this is arguably the most outrageous out of the whole list.
This is the one that caused us to do this episode.
To re-import illegal immigrants that have already been deported from the country.
Yeah. Or we're in the process of being
Or we're
deported.
in well, I mean, in some cases, these were flights that had already left American airspace, right?
When
And so-
he issued the order, that's what's so crazy is it's like, how can your order retroactively
turn the planes around with the gang members in them and bring them back into the country.
Okay, so let's explore something here real quick, because I think this was ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous that the president, that theoretically the president doesn't have the power to do this already. The justification, because I read through, what could possibly be the judge's justification? And what Trump used to justify this was the Alien Enemies Act of, I think, 1798. I think it was 1798. So this all came when there was like a proxy war with France, and you had the Alien and Sedition Act under the Adams administration. And the whole concern was that we had these large populations from countries that we were either at war with or were perpetrating, a hostility or threatening the public safety. So we passed this thing. Now there was two elements. You had the Enemy Alien Act and you had the Friendly Alien Act, and one expired in 1800, but just to clarify, here's what the judge said. The judge basically said that, well, you can't use the Enemy Alien Act because we're not in a declared war with Venezuela. And if you look at the code section, it's code section 50 U.S. code section 21-24. They say the act only applies to war. That's not true. That's actually not true. If you actually read a little forward, what it says is it starts off with, whenever there is a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government. Okay, that seems to say, okay, I guess you got a point. But then it goes on, or any invasion or predatory incursion is perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States. That's the section that Trump was saying, hey, they invaded. Right? They invaded. This is a violent gang. They're not just someone that crossed here that's seeking asylum.
and he classified them as terrorists.
Here's going to be the issue, right? Is that at the end of that sentence is any invasion or predatory incursion is perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the United States by any foreign nation or government. Now, here's the confusing part about this. The courts have had no problem giving widespread. I mean, you saw liberal justices saying that, yeah, it was perfectly fine for Barack Obama to drone U.S. citizens in other country, to like drone attack and kill them. Right. But then Donald Trump finds somebody who is no doubt in the country illegally, and incredibly high degree of probability that they're actually affiliated with this really violent gang in Venezuela. I think it's called Tren de Araguas or something like that. That was the gang that was actually in Colorado taking over apartment complex. Remember when they told us that's not happening? And then we saw videos of it happening. They're like, okay, well, it's kind of happening. Like, screw you.
But not very much.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit.
It's just a little. They haven't taken over the complex,
It's only a few complexes.
Yeah. So anyways, that's what this justice was saying, is that technically if you're using this as your justification for doing this, it doesn't authorize you to do it against this particular group of people. And it should come as a surprise to nobody that that the five guys that were being deported were being represented by the ACLU. Because the ACLU is like very, very on the spot when it comes to using the Constitution to protect people in the country illegally, just not when it comes to your Second Amendment rights, right? And the thing is that once again, this is another case where it could be that, okay, if this judge is saying if you're using this as justification, this is problematic. I think it's fascinating that liberal justices who give all kinds of deference to the executive branch when it's a president that they like for doing any number of things that the executive branch should not be doing. All of a sudden becomes a strict originalist when it's President Trump trying to deport people that were committing acts of violent crime within the United States or affiliated with gangs that are notoriously violent.
Which a gang could kind of be classified as its own little government.
So the issue is like with declaring, and
especially if it operates within another country at its with no deference to the government of that country.
We've seen over and over again how non-state actors, those are international criminal and terrorist organizations, have become a clear and present danger, not just the United States, but countries all over the world. MS-13 had completely destabilized El Salvador, right? And so we did pass certain laws that allowed for us to be able to deal with these non-state actors, because do you declare war against the cartel or do you declare them a terrorist organization and then it frees you up to be able to engage in certain actions to be able to thwart them or to be able to mitigate or degrade them? Like, that's all kind of, I think the common person understands that, that is a reasonable, that's a reasonable thing for the executive branch to be able to do, both with immigration policy, foreign policy, and national defense.
And Congress could fix this.
Yes.
That's just it, is even if there is something in the law that's kind of just a gray area that the justices aren't comfortable with this type of enforcement in this area because of the wording.
Yeah.
Congress could fix the wording. They really could. And they could make adjustments, and we'll go into that just a little bit later because there is somebody already suggested that in some other areas. But we got to keep rolling it along because we're over halfway through our time, but not halfway through our outline. So let's go.
All right.
Number 5. Number 4, sorry.
Here's the next story. A federal judge rules that the dismantling of U.S. aid likely violated the Constitution.
Likely.
And blocks Elon Musk's Doge from further cuts.
I'd like to know where in legalese does likely go into a decision.
Oh, that's the least of my concerns.
No, I understand, but
where on earth does the Constitution mandate the existence of U.S. aid as some sort of entity that the executive branch has no control over? We're talking about the intersection of fiscal policy, which is power of the purse lies in Congress, but it's also the executive branch that spends the money, and foreign policy, which is almost exclusively the purview of the executive branch with the advice and consent of the Senate, and as it's related to international treaties
and treaties. Yeah.
But the idea that it's unconstitutional.
Well, they didn't rule that it was unconstitutional. They ruled that it was likely unconstitutional. So they couldn't even give like a definitive, this is unconstitutional. They're just like, it probably is, so therefore we're going to block.
I think this is the clear, I think out of all the ones we've looked at so far, this is the clearest cut case of a judge wanting a particular outcome and then just declaring it to be so.
I don't know if that's the clearest cut because...
I said so far.
Okay.
So far.
So let's get to the next one real quick.
Oh, we just want to, there's nothing else to say on this front?
I mean,
not really. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Is what it is.
And these are all things where it's like everybody's calling for the president just not to comply with this because,
that's me.
Yeah, because, and if the president doesn't comply, what happens then, you know? Okay. So the next one though is, I think tops that last one.
Oh yeah, no, this one takes the cake. Judge blocks Trump's transgender military ban. I love the description here.
Yeah.
U.S. District Judge Anna Reyes said the policy is, quote, soaked in animus and discriminates against transgender people. Who could forget the soaked in animus clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is
every entry level,
Well,
the thing is that in the military, you know, you need to be fit for service if you're going to serve in the military. And if you have severe, you know, breaks with reality.
So I was on OAN yesterday and this question came up and I said, well, I think this, first of all, we understand that the president is the commander in chief. We also understand that, you know, there's limits on what the president can do. The president can automatically show up and say, I don't like people from New Jersey, so you're not allowed to be in the military. That would be a clear violation of civil rights. This is the problem with taking something, which I'm sorry, it is a mental disorder, and then elevating it
I'm not sorry.
Wait a second.
It absolutely is a mental disorder.
Elevating it to the level of like race or sex. That's
like
what we've done here.
Like a protected class.
The Democrats have just out of thin air created a protected class based off of somebody. Like this used to be categorized. In some cases, it's still categorized as a mental disorder called gender dysphoria, right? Because it is. This is. I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble for this. I don't care because I got asked, like, well, what do you think about trans people being able to serve in the military? I said, I think it's a bad idea. Like I can sympathize with somebody who is struggling with gender dysphoria. I can sympathize with somebody who's struggling with gender dysphoria who wants to serve in the military. But I don't think it's unreasonable to say that if you have such a major psychological break with reality, that not only do you believe that you are something that you are quite clearly not, but you insist that everybody else believe it as well, I'm not going to hand you explosives or a machine gun. And it turns out in the military of these United States, I used to handle a lot of explosives and machine guns. So please don't tell me that the president cannot say, hey, look, this particular mental disorder should not be permitted to serve in the military. Now, listen, go through, get the appropriate counseling, figure out, like, go ahead and once again reconcile your deeply held psychological belief with physical reality, and then we'd be proud to have you serve in the United States military.
Well, the problem is that there are a lot of other mental disorders that the military is able to block you from entering for, especially if it's one that requires a lot of medication and things like that. Well, this one does, especially if somebody is, I mean, the crazy thing is there are a lot of considered elective surgeries that people can't get in the military through TRICARE, but gender reassignment is. So if you're a guy who thinks he's a woman, the military will pay for your breast implants. But if you're a woman who was born with smaller breasts and wish they were larger, they will not pay for them.
Oh, how about this? I don't think they even, if you were a woman that had breast cancer and had to get a double mastectomy
and want reconstructive
I don't think they
surgery, they won't pay for that.
But if you're a dude that says I'm a girl and now you want them, oh, okay. Well, because that's a violation of your civil rights.
They'll even fashion you a penis from your arm skin.
So what the hell are we even doing here? Like, I'm sorry. This is insanity.
Why is it even a question?
The military does not exist for social engineering. The military exists to kill people and blow things up. Well, at the end of the day.
To that point, I'll tell you exactly why.
Hang on. Like, at some point, we need to stop asking, where's the appropriate code section? And just be like,
you're an idiot.
You're an idiot. I'm sorry, but this is the natural. This is the natural consequence of creating protected classes in the first place. Because what you end up getting is a sprawling bureaucracy, a sprawling legal code, and eventually you find yourself in a position where we have to add people into our armed forces who are very clearly not in a position to enter into like combat duty,
especially considering mental health is such an issue anyway.
Again, like the question I just got to ask is, this is honestly why I've become so like not even red pilled, black pilled on proceduralism itself, because this is the logical consequence of us viewing the law as a kind of standalone entity that does not have any sort of practical application to people. Laws are written by men. Laws need to be, obviously I'm not talking about natural law, right? But like, I'm not talking about the physical laws of the universe, right? But like laws as we conceive them, they're written by men, they're enforced by men, and they exist for men, for a specific endpoint as it relates to its impacting us as individuals. They don't exist as standalone entities independent of the men who write, enforce, and live under them. And eventually, when you start treating the law as its own standalone entity, you get this. Inevitably, you get this. And somebody at some point just needs to put their foot down and be like, no, we're not going to do something that is clearly to the detriment of the national security of the very country that the law is supposed to exist to protect and govern.
When you can see, wait a second, you can see the justification they always start to use too. They drag everything back to the original civil rights argument.
Yeah,
right?
like I said, it's the natural consequence of protected classes.
Well, and so they elevate everything to this idea that, well, you used to say, when you say that the military is not a petri dish for social engineering, you used to say that too when it came to race or when it came to, it's like, are we not allowed to make any distinctions between somebody who, again, there is no, in my mind, there's no practical reason to say you're not allowed to serve in the military because of the color of your skin. But to equate that, which I think was a horrible decision, you were actually depriving the United States military of incredibly qualified and courageous members, right? That's what you were doing with that policy. In this case, what you're effectively doing is you're saying that your deep psychological break with reality has now been elevated to make you a protected class. I mean, think about this for a second. I can't show up to the United States military and say, or I can't show up in any other sector of the population and say, I'm black, I want this special carve out, or I want this special set aside, or I want this special consideration. They're going to look at me and go, no, you're not. But when it comes to transgenderism, I can literally just come out and say, I now identify as this, and you must adjust your reality to accommodate mine.
Especially considering that gender is a much bigger biological difference than how much melanin is in your skin. I mean, you're talking about an entirely different makeup. We're talking about totally different DNA, totally different, biological capabilities and functions. I mean, bone structure, lung capacity, the way the muscle is.
Do you get why I've become increasingly less concerned about appeals from the left to the Constitution, the rule of law?
Well, and we all know it's not about the Constitution at all. If you click to the next one.
But hang on. Before we jump ahead, Tina.
No, we're not jumping ahead. We're on the same topic. Go to the next thing.
I know.
This judge
it came down. By the way, actually, before we do that, I just want to show Elon's tweet here because he'll tee up a broader conversation we'll have near the end of this episode. Andy Ogles, who's a representative from Tennessee, basically was furious about some of these rulings and was like, both James Madison and Thomas Jefferson disagree with you, so does the Constitution. We're going to keep the impeachments coming. And Elon Musk said, for 2 centuries, there had never been such an extreme abuse of the legal system by activists pretending to be judges. Impeach them. He's certainly not wrong with the analysis that he's drawing there, because turns out the federal judge that blocked the executive order banning transgender people in the military is LGBTQ.
Yeah.
First LGBTQ federal judge in D.C. So she's breaking some glass ceilings.
Breaking some glass ceilings and idiocy. But the point being that, like, the reason that I've become just so detached from the concerns to my Constitution, rule of law, this upsets, checks and balances and precedent and all these things, is because they don't care about these things at the end of the day. We know, we all, unless you're 4 years old, we all lived through COVID. We all lived through the BLM riots. We all lived through the Great Awakening. I was told repeatedly that these documents are outdated, antiquated. They need to be chucked aside. They were written by racist, white, slave-owning men. But the second that they serve an expedient end to defending whatever social engineering project that the left thinks is in its own benefit, they will cite these things. They will cite the individuals that wrote these things, but they don't actually care about them. These are two-faced liars at the end of the day. And I'm not going to let them use my principles against me. That's not how this works.
Well, I think, and look, we got one more decision to go through, because I want to unpack that a little bit more, because there's something to it, right? I completely agree that there's something to it. But let's get to this last decision, because do we already...
Yeah, so on this front, judge rules against female athletes seeking mandatory gender testing in NCAA to combat trans inclusion. So does this relate to the executive branch, though, or is this just more an insane ruling?
Well, we're talking about insane rulings.
Yeah.
It's not just executive branch. It's insane rulings.
Okay, so now we're outside, the typical appeals to, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 of the Constitution, the division of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. This is more just insanity in general.
Well, and
within the court system.
This also goes. I mean, obviously, there's been a very concerted effort by the Trump administration. They've signed executive orders.
Yeah.
They've talked about withholding funding. So it still applies to that. The question then becomes, how do you enforce it? Right. This is always the question of law. Is that most people are operating off of this instinct of, well, people are generally reasonable. That is generally true with respect to their day-to-day interactions. But when it comes to manipulating the law to try to achieve an end state, that's where all of a sudden they become unreasonable. That's where you can always find unreasonable examples. And so I've explained this to people before. It's like, if you want a law for this, understand, how do you write it to where it can be enforced while minimizing misinterpretation or abusive use of the power? Like, how do you do it? It's why I'm constantly telling people, stop trying to solve all your stupid problems through the government, because it's a really, really, janky mechanism and a very violent mechanism to do it. But in this case, it's like, once again, it used to be, this wasn't a debate 52 seconds ago. This wasn't a debate on whether or not boys should be going in and dominating girls' sports. And then the Democrats all of a sudden decided, then the woke left decided that this was their latest cause celeb. This was their latest oppressed category. And now they were going to be, by the way, for the party of women who can't define women, who now have completely thrown women under the bus. And then the one thing the Democratic Party does to entice you is says, hey, we'll let you kill your kids in the womb. Stick with us. Right? This is absurd. This is fundamentally absurd on so many levels. And to Christian's point, this is also where we get back to it. It's like, we shouldn't even be having to deal with saying, hey, we've got to test you now. But why do we? Well, it's because some people do such a good job through cosmetic surgery and through chemicals and through everything else that they are determined to force their way into a women's sport, or they're determined to just make it an issue. So now a judge can conveniently sit back and say, well, look, you can't subject someone to a medical test before they compete in sports. Really?
That's not true. We already do it.
You make me do a urine test. You make me test for like performance enhancing drugs. You make me do all these other things. Why is this one sacred? And once again, it's because they've elevated this to a civil rights issue when it never should have been one.
Right. It's ridiculous, because you get to a certain point in sports where you do have to submit to certain types of testing to make sure that you don't have some kind of unfair advantage. And so this is not a matter of, oh, now you're going to start testing people. No, they already get tested. All this is you're just running it through one more small thing.
Here's my question.
In fact, when you do test for those things, I'll almost guarantee you could tell right off the bat if it's a man or a woman.
Well, here's my question. Should we test for age? Right? Should we engage in ageism pretty heavy when it comes to sports, right? Like last time I checked, we don't allow high school seniors to compete in the Pee Wee leagues. Why is that? Is that ageism? Are we actually engaging in a civil rights violation? What if somebody identifies as being younger? And then what you will inevitably hear is somebody on the left go, well, that's ridiculous. I remember when 5 years ago you thought this was ridiculous, and then it magically wasn't anymore. So to Christian's point, I don't care about convincing you. You've already proven to me you're not reasonable, because logic, reason, facts, evidence, data, you only apply that when you think it suits you. And the moment it doesn't, it becomes a tool of the oppressor and you completely throw it out. So I don't trust you. I don't trust your judges. Right. And I'm not going to pretend that we're actually debating the same thing right now. You have determined time and time again that the only argument you're capable of making is a bad faith one. So I don't argue with you. I defeat you.
Right. There is one more court case.
Damn, Nick has become red pilled. Finally.
Yeah. Judge blocks Trump's EPA from terminating $14 billion in grants.
I'm sorry. I've got to go back to the whole. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm going to defeat you. If it weren't for the fact that Nick has to get on the road to meet,
we're down to 15 minutes. So let's go.
To meet with Trump later today. I would harp on that a lot more. We need to talk about that in a future episode. But yeah, this story is insane. You already read the title, so
yeah.
The audience knows about this. Again, it's USAID all over again. It's the federal government. Not really the federal government, the executive branch of the federal government apparently has no control over the executive branch of the federal government. Like, isn't it really convenient that the president of the United States is utterly powerless to do anything except increase the power and scope of the bureaucracy?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. If he wanted to add to it, they'd be all about it.
Yeah.
We have a toothless president that can't do anything except increase the power of the managerial class, except give more authority to progressives that have hijacked all the federal institutions.
Yeah.
That if you want to do that, if you want to run an FDR style administration, you can be as powerful as you want.
Yeah.
But the second you want to go after the bureaucracy, or the second you want to do something that the bureaucracy doesn't want to do, suddenly you lose all authority whatsoever. You go from being, essentially having no limitations on your power, right? When you're aligned with the bureaucracy, to you have arguably less authority than the king of the United Kingdom.
We will say less authority than any low-level judge who just decides to issue a ruling. And that's why we're getting to this whole judicial supremacy situation.
Yeah, so we got to fly through some of these things. There's some interesting clips here that I want to go through because there's one man in the Oval Office that has Trump's ear that is doing a phenomenal job of dismantling these arguments, and that man is Stephen Miller. So I've got a couple clips that I just want to play real quick, and we don't need to play the whole thing, but he's excellent. He's super based.
President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio had engaged in intensive diplomacy to obtain a bilateral security agreement with the nation of El Salvador. If a district court judge can enjoin that bilateral security agreement, then we do not have a democracy.
Stephen, you've made your argument.
We do not have a foreign policy.
We've heard you say this. Did you ignore, did the administration ignore the order from the district judge? It's a simple question.
I've answered it. I've answered it because the Department of Justice has made a filing in the court. But let me make another point. The judge, in this case, put the lives of every single person on those aircraft at risk. Did he know how much fuel was in those planes? Did he know the flight conditions? Did he know the weather conditions? Did he know how many crew hours? Did he know the need for crew rest? Did he know any of that? No. This judge violated the law. He violated the Constitution. He defied the system of government that we have in this country.
What do you, I mean, I won't play the entire clip just because we're short on time, but like, Miller is excellent at pushing back against the media when they're like, you're triggering a constitutional crisis. You're ignoring the courts. And he's pointing out all the different logical issues with that line of reasoning. My favorite part of this is the fact that he's bringing up that, look, if we accept these rulings on the face of them as legitimate rather than as illegitimate, which is what he's arguing, what we are basically saying is we're outsourcing the ability of who gets to determine foreign policy in this case to the judiciary. Effectively, there are no checks and balances in this country because the judiciary doesn't answer to anybody except the judiciary itself.
This is why we said before, this is the danger of turning what is an important branch of government and which should be an independent, like a co-equal branch, into a kind of like woke priest class that gets to decide what's going on by judicial fiat.
Well, and she right there is basically touting supremacy. Judicial supremacy. She's saying like, you're not, why aren't they, submitting to the authority of the courts? And so what's crazy about this is in our next link, it's just to show that it's there, is just like a year ago, the Democrats had a serious problem with the supremacy with supremacy as well. So we're not the only ones who have had this issue. And they list all these different court cases where supremacy should not have existed and that the courts, the justices should not have supremacy over these situations. But now that Trump is in charge, they have completely flipped the script. And so let's not pretend that they are like, they love the Constitution and they're so worried about this. Or let's not pretend that they've always agreed with judicial supremacy. And not only that, but like what level of courts should have supremacy in any kind? Like why in the world can a low-level federal judge issue an injunction which stops the actions of the President of the United States?
Well, and this is, so let's acknowledge something. This is a difficult, but it's also an important question. And that's where it does come to the power to issue an injunction. It is one thing for a lower court to rule, hey, I think this violates the Constitution. And then it goes up the court system, right? So it starts at the lower courts, moves up to the appellate courts, and then eventually can arrive at the Supreme Court. The question is can literally any federal district judge immediately stop anything the executive branch is doing or anything that Congress has directed at their level? Like, is there no review? Because you've got to think about this from a practical consideration. Because one argument is, well, yeah, Nick, of course, when the government is doing something that the court is determined to be unconstitutional, wouldn't you want them to stop that right away? To which I would respond, A, they never seem to do it when liberal presidents are doing things that they want.
Right.
So I don't It's a bad faith argument.
Like student loan debt.
Again, if they were being consistent across the board, I would be far more open to the argument. But two, I want you to think about this just from the practical application of the law. If any time the lowest level federal district judge can say, hey, I don't think that's constitutional, injunction, what you're essentially saying is that all the other two branches that are supposed to be co-equal, that are supposed to have their individual functions and responsibilities and duties, can be stopped in the execution of those at any time by one judge without any sort of review process. And so this is the part where we do need to ask the question with the understanding that this is a sword that cuts both ways. You might like it when an injunction goes up against a president that you think is doing something highly unconstitutional. But there is a reasonable question to be asked is, if, especially on issues where we give, incredible deference to the president of the United States, like foreign policy, like national defense, does it really make sense for that sort of power to rest at the lowest, federal district court? Or should it be something where it's like, no, you got to at least make it to an appellate court? Or no, it's the Supreme Court that has the power to say, no, we're going to stop this while we review it.
And that's also the issue, is that when there is a problem, it seems like the appellate courts and the whole system just, it responds when it feels like responding.
Yeah.
It's like, we'll get to it next year.
Well, because
or maybe we won't get to it at all.
Because it's a co-equal branch of government, so it gets to set its own schedule with
so
respect
they
to what
get
it
to
hears
set
or
their
what
own
it chooses
stuff,
to hear.
but the other branches don't. And that's the thing, is their whole argument is only the judiciary can hold the judiciary accountable. Well, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. Should it not be the same way for the executive branch, since all of this falls under the executive branch?
So,
shouldn't they be the ones that decide their thing? That's why I think it's absurd. We do have a mechanism to hold justices accountable, but they just don't like it when we talk about it.
Well, so on that front, we've got another clip to go. Not clip, but actually, we do have one more that I need to go through. It's another Stephen Miller clip, far better than the first one, in my opinion. But before we get to that, on that front, Tina was hinting at impeachment. So here's a headline that Chief Justice Roberts pushes back against calls to impeach judges who rule against Trump. Roberts issued a statement following Donald Trump's call for a judge to be impeached for ruling against the administration.
Can we read his statement, though? Not just the headline.
Trump was calling for the impeachment of that judge that issued that ruling related to the flights to El Salvador. And Roberts says, for more than 2 centuries, it's been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. So what Roberts is essentially saying, I don't know if he fully realizes that. Actually, I think he does realize it. What he's essentially saying is that only the judiciary can check the judiciary, which is fundamentally incorrect. There are 2 mechanisms through which the legislative branch, this is where Congress comes into play, can actually hold the judiciary accountable. The first one Tina just hinted at, which is impeachment. I'm not as gung-ho about that, just because mathematically it just can't be done. When you get, here's something I just need to tell the audience directly. When you hear influencers on social media talking about impeachment, they're either ignorant or they're grifting.
Okay, well let me say this.
That sounds harsh, but that is correct.
There's a third option. There's a third option, and that's the people that are talking about it as a mechanism that they wish was more viable than it actually is.
Sure, if they say something like, I wish we could, but like, if they're hinting that like, we're going to do this, I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, we are not going to impeach a single justice because we don't have the votes in the Senate to remove anybody from office. So it is a total and complete waste of time to discuss impeachment because it is physically impossible to be done. Democrats have the votes to block any impeachment mechanism for anybody. So it's just a waste of time to talk about. But there's a second element, which is far more interesting, because the Constitution only dictates that there's one court that must exist in this country at the federal level, and that's the Supreme Court. Every other court in this country at the federal level is a creation of the legislative branch. And so if you want to talk about doing kind of quote unquote extreme things, I think this is actually a logical thing, is just eliminate the courts that are doing these things. Like literally through the legislature, eliminate the DC Circuit Court.
It is
because this is where most of this stuff is coming from.
Well, through the legislature, they could set up parameters for who has jurisdiction over certain things and whether or not things decisions could be expedited or basically the Supreme Court could be compelled by law to take up this matter because of how important it is or something like that.
That's a little bit more dubious constitutionally.
No,
because what the Supreme Court could say is we don't find. So let's say Congress says we're going to require you to take up this particular issue. The Supreme Court could essentially say we don't find that constitutional because you can't dictate those
That's not what I mean.
terms.
That's not what I mean. Basically, if something falls within the executive, like if it's an action of the president that is now being checked, it needs to be the Supreme Court that checks it. That's what I mean. So basically, some of these lower level federal courts, just because they're federal, can't be the one to check on the president. It should be the Supreme Court.
What's going to happen, though, if that policy was put into place, what's going to happen, though, is that the Supreme Court would become overwhelmed with lawsuits. It's the Linsky tactic, right? If your policy is reply to every letter, send 50,000 letters, right? Just destroy your enemies using their own principles and their own policies against them. And so if we accept that, and I'm not saying that I disagree, I'm just simply pointing out that like if we accept the proposition that only the Supreme Court should be able to have the power to check the executive branch in any instance, then what you're implying is that any lawsuit against the executive branch by anybody else, some union that's representing federal workers that are getting fired, for example, would just have to immediately go to the Supreme Court. Yeah. They will file 10,000 lawsuits.
That's why I said it's
overwhelm
the
court. Yeah, but they could refuse to hear those.
Wait a second. That's
just like they refuse to hear other things.
That's why I said this is a double-edged sword, right? Thomas Jefferson said this right off the bat. He was always concerned about the federal judiciary in part because how do you keep a consistent check on it? How do you keep a check on the judiciary because the way we do it with the legislature is not just separation of powers, but we also do it with elections. All right. But if you're going to have a federal judiciary, especially, when you get a Supreme Court that serves for life, and I'm not necessarily saying that is in and of itself a bad decision, but it's like all of this is about trade-offs. All of this is about trade-offs. Here's what I don't think the judiciary properly respects about what's going on right now. This is where the issue of judicial philosophy is incredibly important. Because once you start to because there is no perfect system where you're perfectly held in check, right? Nowhere in the Constitution does it actually say that the Supreme Court is the only entity that can determine what something is constitutional. It doesn't say that. Judicial review was granted to the Supreme Court by the Supreme Court in Marbury versus Madison. And we just kind of went along with it because it kind of seemed to make sense and we weren't exactly sure how to interject with it. But Stephen Miller, again, brings up an important point on this. And that is, in order for representative government to be able to function, you need to have both limitations on power, but you also need to have realms where the people that are responsible for executing that power have enough latitude to actually execute it.
So on that point, I want your reaction to this clip, Nick and Tina, because I think he does an excellent job of articulating the position that we should be articulating. And I know that we're short on time.
This is the low volume one, right?
Yes, this is the low volume one. Oh, Tina lied.
Tina lied. That's why I was pointing at it. Right,
she said that there's no volume or no audio.
All right. So this is Steve Miller discussing kind of the issue that we were just talking about.
Yeah. Yes.
Start from the beginning, though.
Well, I've started with him.
Oh, okay. Got it.
With him answering the question because this is the. If you listen to the beginning of this question, it's really hard to hear.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Because he's outside in front of the White House. But he was basically answered a question, or he was asked a question about, are you violating, these rulings and stuff like that?
Well, again, the whole thing is just preposterous. So, as the Department of Justice has said in writing, nothing that the administration did conflicted with the court order. But there's a bigger issue here, which is the court order is patently unlawful. And if we got into a place in this country where district court judges could, for example, help is the wrong word, could interfere and direct specific targeting or non-targeting in, say, Houthi-controlled territory, could direct which general on the battlefield is going to be in charge of making which decisions, could direct, for example, we can send this military
asset to this country, but not this country, could direct what intelligence we could share with Israel versus with Saudi Arabia. If a district court judge can be involved in the conduct of our foreign policy, under no definition do we have a democracy in this country. I mean, not to get too philosophical, but for a long time in this country, power has been concentrated principally in two areas: the unelected bureaucracy and the unelected judiciary. And power has been increasingly concentrated in these two areas. And in the case of the hard left, the judiciary takes steps to protect the bureaucracy, and that further it shrinks the circle in which democracy is occurring. So take an example, just like firing recalcitrant bureaucrats. So bureaucrats serve at the pleasure of the president. The president is elected by the American people. So you have unelected judges protecting the jobs of unelected bureaucrats to pursue their own policy preferences. So when Americans vote for big shifts in policy, they're voting for the president. And so we tend to think about executive power as this, well, it should be, and we ought to think about it as being a unified power. But what it's become increasingly is a severed power, and more of it has been accumulated in the bureaucracy. And then when unelected judges empower the bureaucracy. So, for example, there's a large section of our bureaucracy that doesn't want to deport any of these aliens, right? And they collude with the ACLU and the judiciary to try to keep them here in this country. So this is really about the restoration of democracy and saying that the person that's elected by the whole American people can implement these big policy shifts. Otherwise, what you have, which has unfortunately afflicted a lot of the Western world, is a situation where voters can't vote for the change that they want. And so this is really fundamentally about democracy. The American people said to get these terrorist gangs the hell out of our country. The president has plenary authority under the Constitution, under the Alien Enemies Act, under the INA, under core Article 2 powers to achieve that. And no district court judge who presides over just some small, like little geography of the whole country could possibly presume to have the authority to direct the expulsion of terrorists from our soil, who, by the way, are also here illegally. Thank you, everybody.
So it was a bit long, but what do you think?
Oh, brilliant. Right. So he perfectly articulated both the problem with the unelected bureaucracy and the unelected judiciary, right? And then the only thing that I would add to that is that increasingly what's happening within our society, within our system of government, is people are becoming frustrated because they're not sure who to blame when something happens. And the tendency is, well, you blame the people you elect, right? Because they're the ones that have the power, of course. And what he's articulating is no, like increasingly that has not been the case. The bureaucracy is able to subvert your elected officials, and the unelected judiciary is also able to subvert your elected officials, and they work in collusion with one another to achieve their desired end states. And this is primarily rooted in this idea of like legal positivism. Like, so I remember I was actually at a Heritage Foundation event, and I can't remember who there was a left-leaning news guy there. I can't remember what his name was, but he was saying, well, judicial activism is when the Supreme Court overrules Congress. And I said, no, that can't be judicial activism, because sometimes it's appropriate to overrule Congress. If Congress came up with a bill yesterday that said, hey, we've decided the First Amendment doesn't apply anymore, it would be perfectly appropriate for the Supreme Court to determine that that was a violation of the Constitution. No, judicial activism is when a judge ignores the law in pursuit of their own ideological preferences or their own interpretation of what they believe justice would be. That's activism. And it has to be that definition. But the left is increasingly, they have this, again, just like everything else within leftist ideology, it's fluid. Definitions are fluid in order to give them an advantage when it comes to debating these issues. And so I think Stephen Miller did a great job of articulating the problem here. And it is a trade-off, right? It is a trade-off. Obviously, we want the courts to be able to provide a particular function. But there is something, I think, inherently problematic about, again, a lower court judge being able to completely to insert themselves into something and say, we're going to do an injunction on this, and now you're not allowed to conduct foreign affairs or national defense policy. Wait, what? Like, does anybody honestly believe that that is an appropriate way for a government to function? Now, you will occasionally be able to find times where you agree with whatever the federal judge did. And you will be able to come up with times where you agree with the executive branch did. But the real question here is constitutionally, where should that power rest? Now, that's not to say that a federal judge can't issue an opinion, but should they be able to stop everything dead in its tracks? Right? And so Loyal to Law said, question, who checks the lower courts? Well, again, according to Justice Roberts, it's the higher courts. Right? The lower courts are checked by the appellate courts. The appellate courts are checked by the Supreme Court. And yes, that is a mechanism whereby an institution checks itself. Sure. The real question is what's the outside element which checks the courts? Because if the only check on power that they have is internal, then ultimately they don't have a genuine check on power. And this goes back to what Jefferson was saying. This goes back to concerns that Madison had.
And this also goes back to why it is that so many people are calling for President Trump to ignore some of these orders. Mm-hmm. And because if he ignores them, it forces the issue and kind of expedites opinions. And so if he ignores it and doesn't comply, the sense of urgency for another court to take it up is a little bit higher than it would be if he just complied.
So that's the third option. Remember when I said that there's two ways to check the court? You can impeach, which is a waste of time talking about, or you could just through Congress, you can change the designation of some of these courts because they're creations of the outside the Supreme Court. They're creations of the legislative branch. The third option is the Andrew Jackson option.
It's the court has made their decision. Now let's see them
enforce it. But, and Biden actually did that with the student loans. I mean, he continued on. And so I don't want to hear it from the left. They were all about it when it was student loans being spent, or for debt forgiveness to people that didn't want to pay their student loans.
Well, this is the part where I think the next step after what Steve Miller is saying and what we've already elaborated on here a couple times is that if you want people to lose, because no institution is perfect, because there is no such thing as an absolute perfect check and balance to where the bad thing can never happen, right? There's always a trade-off. But the big fear here, the big problem here, which I don't know if the left realizes it or they don't care, and either is, I would say, 50-50 chance. But it's this idea that ultimately what we're getting to here is a point where the left has actually convinced conservatives to be less concerned about separation of powers and checks and balances.
Yeah.
Because
we used to care.
Because it's become so obvious that this will only be brought up by the left when they get a decision they don't like. There's no consistency. The whole problem with legal positivism, the whole problem with, again, activist judicial philosophy, which is absolutely the predominant philosophy of the left, is that judges have an individual responsibility to interpret the law in such a way that they believe will achieve justice. What the hell does that mean? It essentially means that they believe judges should be empowered to achieve the outcome they want. Well, that's no longer a faithful interpretation of law. The restraining component of the judiciary is supposed to be originalism. And I will say this before, there was this great debate between Justice Scalia and I think it was Justice Breyer, where Breyer was like, well, of course you want different judicial philosophies. And Scalia was like, no, you don't. There's only, let me say it right now, there is only one truly legitimate judicial philosophy when it comes to interpreting law. One. And I feel perfectly comfortable saying that. It is originalism. It's the idea of your job as a justice is to look at the law. It's to look at the language that was used and what the meaning of those words were. What is the reasonable interpretation of the meaning of those words at the time it was written, and then to render a decision. Now, a good originalist will render decisions they don't agree with respect to policy or the achievement of justice.
But we've unfortunately learned that that's a losing game.
Well, wait a second. Let me finish this, because if we don't actually lay the case for what we want with a judicial, what a good, reasonable, honest, transparent judiciary looks like, if we can't establish that, then there's no point in having any of this, right? The judiciary will fall eventually if it follows the path that it has been following down legal positivism. If you accept this philosophy, right, and anything other than my job is to look at the law, what the legislature put in, what the president signed, and to faithfully interpret that, all right, you will inevitably render decisions that you believe are unjust with respect to the outcome but perfectly just with respect to a faithful interpretation of the law. That is the only appropriate judicial philosophy. Anything else is essentially engaging in a form of judicial supremacy, where now who cares what your local elected, who cares what your state officials think, who cares what your federal officials think, who cares about who you elected, because a judge can now unilaterally decide, yeah, I know they said that, and I know that's what the law says, and I know that's what the tradition has been for hundreds of years, but I think it should be this.
It'd be good if we made it.
And so now it's this, because and you've even seen these legal positivists say that, well, I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg was evolving standards of decency. Let me explain something to you, Justice. Your job is not to arbitrarily decide for 330 million Americans what the evolving standards of decency are. You know how we do that? Through the electoral process, through the legislative process. That's how we do that. That's how we tell you what we think the new standards should be. But the moment you assume for yourself that right above everything else, then we fall into exactly what Thomas Jefferson warned us about, which is a judicial oligarchy. And so the thing I want everyone to understand is that nice liberal judge that's just trying to achieve justice, that has adopted that sort of judicial philosophy, is a tyrant. And as much as you might like their decision in individual cases, they're doing exactly what you just said. They are breaking the system to where now there's a complete lack of trust in it. And if you want to invite the sort of strong man politics the Democrats are constantly warning us about, adopt that as your primary judicial philosophy. The problem is they already have, and they have for decades now.
They've been doing it for decades. Judicial positivism is effectively it's a form of political theology from a left-wing perspective.
Yeah.
It accepts the idea that the law is making determinations between good and evil, and because these people all believe in left-wing progressivism, they already have their conception of what the good is.
Yep.
Spoiler alert: it's actually evil.
Yep.
And so now, because they've made that determination of what the good is, they're now saying, well, because all politics is just applied theology, I'm going to force the outcome that I believe is good, regardless of whatever the law says. Because again, the rule of law is a construct, created, written, decades or centuries ago by, the bad guys, right? The evil white slave owning men. And so in a way, it is applied political theology from a left-wing perspective. And what they're eventually going to get, because they've been doing this for actually they've been doing this for longer than my lifetime. They've been doing this for 40, 50, 60 years now, probably going back to FDR actually, right? So maybe even 80 years. What they're eventually going to get is a form of political theology from the right. These type of rulings are going to lay the groundwork one day for the right to engage in their own form of judicial positivism. I guarantee you that is what's going to happen, because a day will come where conservatives are going to say, what is the point of originalism if we are the only originalists? We are basically restraining ourselves from being able to engage in determinations of good versus evil. They've already made the determination that this is all just a battle between good and evil, and we have our conception of the good, and we are going to force it on you by judicial fiat. And we're sitting here saying, but the law doesn't allow that. And they're saying, I don't care. This is good. This is evil. We're going to force it on you. And so eventually we're going to come back and say, well, your conception of the good is manifestly evil, and we're not going to tolerate it. We're not going to allow you to steamroll us using our own principles against us to force evil upon us. And a lot of these rulings are evil. The idea that we need to re-import criminal illegal aliens into this country, the idea that we need to force transgenderism in the military, the idea that we're going to strip the executive's ability to fire hostile federal bureaucrats that are working around the clock, night and day, in order to undermine his agenda that the American people voted for. The idea that we're going to force the federal taxpayer to hand out billions to NGOs who despise them and are implementing a set of policies that they just voted against, 4 or 5 months ago? All of those things are currently happening right now in the judiciary. What's inevitably going to happen is the right is going to say, okay, you are engaging in political theology. You've said these things are good, these things are evil. I disagree with your theology, and I'm going to stop you.
Well, and this is the problem is that leftism has turned judges into a priest class. Oh, well, they have spoken. Again, unless they don't like it, then they're a heretic, right? And they should. So this is the part that I think we've talked about this so much, and I'm glad we had this opportunity to actually look at it case by case, because there were cases in here where I can arrive at the same conclusion, or I shouldn't say arrive. I can understand a good faith argument for some of the decisions that were made, even though I don't like the outcome. The problem is I know it's coming from justices that don't share that judicial philosophy. And I'm tired of the bad faith arguments. I am tired of the bad faith arguments. And I think I know what I'm still dedicated to is, once again, I want to restore and defend our constitutional republic. But the thing I've become increasingly convinced of is that's very, very difficult to do with a large sector of the population that has essentially agreed with these sorts of philosophies, that have agreed with the oppressor-oppressed dynamic and now apply it to the judiciary. Because ultimately they don't give me a place where I can go to engage in civil discourse or to get a decision based off of reason or a fair interpretation of the law. It has to be based off of the arbitrary preferences of whoever the woke have put in power. I'm not going to live under that sort of system. And to Christian's point, there's two alternatives here. There's two alternatives. I pointed this out earlier when we were talking about the Department of Education. I said, when we were having a discussion before the podcast, I said, good news, bad news. The bad news for the woke is that you can no longer use my tax dollars to try to indoctrinate my children. The good news is I'm not like you. We're trying to dismantle the Department of Education, not put it under new management where I can steal your tax dollars to indoctrinate your children. The problem is, though, is that people like me who don't want a massive federal bureaucracy, who don't want a corrupt judiciary that just does whatever I happen to want it to, we will lose this fight. And we will lose it to people on the right who say, you know what? If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. You're going to use the federal bureaucracy to come after us? Well, guess what? We're now using it to come after you. You engaged in lawfare against us? Well, guess what? We're engaging in lawfare against you. I don't want that. But to Christian's point, I do think over time it becomes inevitable unless we can actually correct the ship. And one of the things I admire most about the Trump administration is that even on some of these decisions where I can say, okay, I see maybe where the courts were doing this, he is pushing the issue because all of this needs to be exposed. It's not just about individual bad decisions. It's not just about bad policy. It is about showing the corrupt rot that has taken place within our federal bureaucracy, within the judiciary, because the only way we're going to be able to correct the ship, I hope, back to a point where we don't use the federal government to just punish whoever our ideological enemies are, but we can once again agree on certain precepts upon which our government requires in order to be able to function. You do not have the blessings of liberty in a philosophical void where people can pick up the Constitution when they feel like it, set it aside when they don't. You don't have it when all of a sudden morality is relative. Truth is relative. I can identify as anything I want, and therefore it is just. And now you must conform to what I interpret reality to be. We can't have the sort of society where you have individual liberty, personal responsibility, free markets, civil discourse, equal justice before the law. We can't have it when one side gets to pick it up and then put it down whenever they feel like it and then claim like the rest of us are just being mean. That doesn't work. And so, again, God bless that we're actually exposing this for what it is, because it has to be done. All right, I want to once again. I've got to get ready. I got to take off, as I said before. Heading up to DC today. Some pretty big things going up there, going on right now, and pleasure to be a part of it and be invited to it. But the other thing I will ask everyone to do is, if you haven't already, go and check out Doge Watch. And this Saturday, we are putting out our first Doge Talk. We actually had a really, really good conversation with Senator Rand Paul. Senator Rand Paul is someone that has been fighting for the things that we care about forever, sometimes in a very, very lonely position. And he's finally got an administration that's willing to work with them in order to achieve those objectives. But there's still going to be some differences of opinion on the best way to do it. And we have a great conversation with Rand Paul coming out on Saturday. So go check out Doge Talks. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.